Hello, welcome back to my channel. If you're new around here, my name's Kit, and this is my world. Thank you very much for joining me. In this episode, I'm going to be doing another tag. This is the Somewhat Autobiographical Tag by Mark at Booktime with Elvis, and I stole it from Sina at Beating Around the Books. So, without further ado, let's get cracking. Question number 1. What was the number 1 best-selling book, fiction and or non-fiction, on the day you were born? Have you read them? Well, the answer is Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy by John le Carré. And no, I haven't read it. I started to watch the film and didn't like it very much. Stopped it. And that's it. Question number 2. What are some books, series or standalone that immediately spring to mind when you think of your childhood? Folk Tales by Lila Berg, she's my grandma, and Folk Tales looms quite large in my childhood memories of literature. Also the Narnia books, of course, by C.S. Lewis, and The Borrables by Michael de Larrabiti. Question number 3. School days are the best days of your life, apparently, but there you were forced to read some books you maybe wouldn't have chosen for yourself. Which did you enjoy? Well, first of all, my school days were the worst days of my life, and yes, indeed, I was forced to read books that I didn't want to and didn't enjoy. Some of them are books that I might have enjoyed if I'd been allowed to discover them on my own, but they're forever ruined for me by being books that I was forced to read at school. No child should ever be forced to read. Don't get me started. Anyway, my answer to this question is Bridge to Terabithia. That was one of the very rare books that was forced reading at school that was so damn good I enjoyed it anyway. Question number 4. Were you independent or part of a pack at school? Did you join in the reading fads of the day or do your own thing? I was never part of any pack. I did everything alone. I was labelled a loner. Well, actually, I was labelled a problem child because that's what kids with autism were called back in the day. I was educated in a classroom with a sign on the door that said problem children. So that gives you an idea of the mentality of the day. But so I spent all my time alone, often with my nose buried in a book. But certainly if there were any packs, I wasn't invited. Question number 5. As you moved into your turbulent teens, can you remember your first experience encountering sex in a book? You assume that I waited until my teens for that first encounter. Sex was very much a part of my life from earliest childhood. I can't remember a time in my life that I wasn't surrounded by sex and very, very aware of it in real life, in films, television, documentaries, and indeed books. I grew up in a very strange environment. It was an extremely artistic, creative, bohemian world. Both my parents were actors. It was the 1970s. My grandma was a very celebrated and famous author who wore saris a lot and bells and jingly things and mirrors and was kind of hippie-ish. My uncle, my mum's brother, was a full-on hippie with a humongous ginger afro. He was part of the Bagwan Indians, I believe. He went to India and joined a cult, essentially. This is the environment I grew up in. I was surrounded by naked people. I was surrounded by sex. There were orgies and things. There were always... Well, my grandma had a cinema in the basement of her house, and she used to run films for audiences of 25 to 30 people, I suppose, which were often on the subject of sex or childbirth, natural childbirth, different ways that you could do it in various hippie-ish ways. And so I grew up watching all this stuff. Sex was just a part of life. In a literary sense, in the sense of books, there was a book called The Little Red Book, which was, I suppose, kind of a secretive and taboo book for a lot of people, but for us it was just on the bookshelves. There were bookshelves everywhere, there were piles of books everywhere, and The Little Red Book was just one of the many, many books that I picked up with my teeny tiny little child hands and read and found thoroughly interesting. I was also, around the age of 5 or 6, given a book called Where Did I Come From, which was full of facts related in a matter-of-fact sort of way about sex, about where babies come from. And it was illustrated with kind of cartoonish style illustrations. I think, was it by Norman Mailer? Someone Mailer, perhaps. Is Norman Mailer a different person? Robert? I'm shit at names. Do you know what? I'll put a thing up, captions and stuff. Editor Kit will sort it out. But yes, Where Did I Come From? That was a book that was specifically given to me to help me understand all about sex and reproduction and that sort of thing. Question number 6. What were some of the first kinds of non-fiction you encountered? Well, the thesaurus, of course, and the dictionary, film review books. My parents were both actors. My dad, in particular, was a very passionate film buff, so there were many film books in the house. Halliwell's and all sorts of other ones. Lots of film review books. Theatre books, of course, books about theatre, books containing collections of plays. There were lots of biographies, of course, and autobiographies, often of actors or directors or people associated with the arts. History books. There were history books everywhere. I was always a history buff, so was my dad. Science books. I was very interested in science. My parents, not quite so much. There were many books in my life, and still are. And I grew up with probably an equal mix of fiction and non-fiction. Question number 7. Whose bookshelf was more fun to read, Mum's or Dad's? Wow, this is a problematic question. First of all, it assumes that there's only a mum or a dad, not two mums or two dads, or other configurations of parental personages. And also it assumes that bookshelves can be divided up into different people's books. I don't like that. I don't feel comfortable with that at all. Maybe it's just me. I grew up in an environment where books were everywhere and they were for everyone to share. They were just books everywhere. And so I helped myself to books that I found interesting, and it didn't really matter to me whether they were gendered for a male parent or a female parent or both. Question number 8. How diverse is your library? See below. Here there is a long list. I think 35 different categories of books are listed in the below bit. And so I'm assuming that the question is asking me to go through those categories and see how many books I have in those categories. So I've done a rough count, and I can say with absolute certainty and honesty that I have at least one book in each of 25 out of the 35 categories, but I can't really be bothered to work out exactly how many books I've got in each category, because I've got many books and I'm lazy. But I know that 25 out of the 35 categories are represented in my book collection on my shelves, but more importantly on my Kindle. And so I would say that my library is pretty reasonably diverse. Question number 9. What type of books do you find difficult to discuss? Honestly, I don't find anything difficult to discuss, but books-wise, I suppose it would be fair to say I'm lacking confidence in some areas. And I suppose the areas that I'm most lacking in confidence in, weird sentence structure, comic books. I've never read comic books. I don't know much about comic books, and I have a certain amount of contempt for comic books, but only out of ignorance. I know that I'm an ignorant person where it comes to comics. So those aren't books that I'm very comfortable discussing because I know nothing and I have prejudices. I may need to work on that. Religious texts for the same reasons. Question number 10. In what way do your life experiences and emotions shape your choice of reading? The one-sentence answer to that is they are inextricably linked. And I don't really know how to give much more detail because they're so closely connected that it's really kind of hard to separate all the strands and all the fibres and analyse them in a macro sort of way and give you any more specifics. My life experiences and emotions are very much a part of what motivates me to read, and the content of what I read, and the content of what I read also makes my life experiences and emotions the things that they are. So it's all bundled up together. It's all one and the same to me. Question number 11. In much the same way as our taste in food changes, so perhaps does our taste in books. How would you say your own reading tastes have evolved over the decades? Well, I suppose the easy way to answer this is to just say I'm growing out of fantasy. I've always been a fantasy buff first and foremost. That was the genre that I fell in love with when I was very, very young, and I've stuck with it throughout my life. Obviously, I've read other kinds of books as well, but fantasy has always been my thing. But recently, I felt myself growing out of fantasy and becoming more interested in exploring other genres and broadening my mind and my reading tastes. But it's a difficult thing because of being a mood reader, and also very recently, I decided to dive back into the Robin Hobb books, the Farseer books, and there are 16 of them, and I'm planning on binging the whole lot. So, having said that I'm growing out of fantasy, I have just decided to plunge back into it again. But I would say that my reading tastes are evolving. They're just doing it slowly. Question number 12. Unfortunately, we all feel down at certain times. Have you got a go-to book to raise you back up? I have bipolar disorder. Books don't work that way with me. When I'm feeling down, I'm not just a little down in the mouth and I need cheering up. When I'm feeling down, I go to bed and stay there for 20 years. That happened. So books don't really work that way for me, unfortunately. But if I have to pick a book that I would consider uplifting, it's a trilogy, and I've discussed it many, many times. It's the Empire trilogy by Raymond E. Feist and Janny Wirtz. Each of the 3 books has a very happy ending, and each happy ending gets happier with the next book until eventually it ends in just an orgy of happiness, and it's all very blissful and uplifting. So that trilogy is probably my go-to for a happy reading experience from beginning to end. Even though terrible bad events happen throughout the books, everything turns out all right in the end, and it's reassuring to know that that's coming up. So that's why I reread it quite a lot. Question number 13. If you have to choose one book or author to represent each decade of your life, who or what would they be? The books should be ones you read in that decade, not necessarily published in that decade. The question's asking for one. Of course, I ignored that part and I've made lists. So let's narrow it down a little bit. Okay, from 0 to 10 years old, it was Lila Berg, my grandma. She was a very prolific and celebrated children's author, also a grown-up author as well, but I read her children's books. C.S. Lewis, Michael de Larrabiti of Borobull's fame, Kenneth Graham, A. Milne. I could go on and on. I was a very prolific reader right from the day I popped out of the womb, probably clutching a book. Anyway, moving on. From age 10 to 20, it was still Michael de Larrabiti, Edgar Rice Burroughs, of course, the Tarzan books, the Pellucida books, all of those things. C.S. Lewis again. Lois Lowry. I loved her Anastasia Krupnik books. Still do. They're absolutely charming, very well written, and I really enjoyed them at that age. Then age 20 to 30, that's where Raymond E. Feist first rears his ugly head, and Janny Wirtz, of course, David Eddings, Catherine Kerr, Bill Bryson. Age 20 to 30 was a big growth spurt in my reading tastes. I discovered lots of new and exciting authors, and adult stuff, grown-up stuff. I really graduated into the more juicy stuff during that age range. And of course, age 30 to 40, it was exactly the same stuff. I was just reading all of those things, rereading all of those things throughout all of those decades. And 40 to 50, which is the bracket I'm in at the moment, it's various. It's all of the above, everything that I've been reading since the day I was born, plus loads of new stuff as well, thanks to being a booktuber. Question number 14. Of course, everyone is entitled to their own opinions, but how do you feel when people say reading is boring, and what would you say in defence of reading? I wouldn't really, to be honest. There's no convincing people to read, and nor should you. Reading should not be forced. There's one surefire, guaranteed way to put people off books, and that's making them read the bloody things. Just leave people alone. If they don't want to read, don't try and convert them. Evangelizing is always bad. People need to discover books for themselves, and if they're going to discover books, then they will enjoy it a lot more if they haven't had a nudge from anyone else. And also, reading doesn't need to be defended. So if someone says reading's boring, I will disagree with them, but I won't defend reading because it's a pointless pursuit. It's stupid. I'll just say, fair enough, you're entitled to your opinion, and get back to my book. Question number 15. What was the number one selling book on the day of your most recent birthday, fiction and or non-fiction? Have you read them? It was Royal by Danielle Steele, the prolific and I think most successful author in the history of the universe. It's a romance, I imagine, because it's Danielle Steele. I've never read a Danielle Steele book ever, and I haven't read that one. But apparently that was the bestseller on the date of my last birthday. And on that note, I think I'll call it a day. Thank you very, very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did and you haven't already, you know what to do. Please hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, share, comment, do all the good stuff, and I will see you next time. See you later.